All right. Our goal here today is to do a set of drafts, right? You remember from the assignment write-up that what's due is a draft rendering. I say a draft rendering, but really what it is it's a comparison of a bunch of draft renderings. Okay, I think I mentioned to you before that I try to teach this class thinking about workflow, right? Start to finish, the whole process, incorporating design, sort of rapid prototyping, what your renderings are going to be, and then coming out with a good product at the end. So what we're simulating today is that rapid prototyping part where we're going to look at a couple different settings. We're going to compare them side by side in an array. It's one image, but it's going to have 3 different images built into it. So let's start talking about the setup of a rendering and what some of the essential features are. Okay, so we're not going to get into the resolution of the image quite yet, not until next week, I think. Just so I can sort of survey the general knowledge, how many of you know the difference between vector and raster graphics? Okay, so it's a new term for most of you. Okay, so this is the best way. You just Google it, right? I'm a Google guy. So vector versus raster graphics, right? Yeah, there you go. This is the best image that I've ever really found that kind of describes what it is. It's perfect. So painting with pixels versus drawing with vectors. Okay, the painting distinction I think is very important because it's almost like one of them is a very manual exercise, even though they're both digital. But one of them feels very manual because you're manipulating just basically this grid of colors, and the other one is mathematically drawing the vector within which fields of color are going to exist. So or around which. Let me qualify that. So anyway, vector graphics are what you see in Rhino and AutoCAD and Illustrator. And raster graphics are what you see in flattened PDFs and in Photoshop. So if you think about the 2 software packages, Illustrator and Photoshop, Illustrator draws with vectors. Photoshop paints with pixels. Is that clear? So, anyway, we're going to use both of those at some point. But it's really important to know that because you sort of have to set up what your view is going to be. I know I'm talking a lot about resolution when we're not really going to do it yet this week, but you do need to know that the resolution of the image that Maxwell is going to produce is basically, as a starting point, your viewport. Meaning it's going to take that image at that scale, and then it's going to output it as an image with however many pixels you have on screen if you don't say otherwise. So generally it's a good idea to kind of maximize this just as a base point to get started. So when we go to Maxwell, we're going to go to the scene manager again. And like I said, generally speaking, this is your hub for everything. There are a few other specialty tools that we're going to use throughout, but all of our settings for probably the first half of the class are all going to exist here, with the exception of 1 or 2. So let's just start going through it. Don't worry about extensions. You are concerned with camera, okay? And not tremendously so, but this is where you're going to start to set up what the resolution is and certain properties of the lens or filtering for how the digital camera is going to capture light. So your f-stop and EV, and I forget what EV actually stands for now, but anyway, if any of you have ever taken a photography class or if you're familiar with actual photography, not just iPhone photography, you know f-stop is an actual physical camera principle, right? It's like an actual mechanism. I'm not a camera guy, so I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I could talk through a few of them. Anyway, so you kind of have to set all that stuff based off of physical implications, okay? But generally speaking, the base presets are enough to get us going. So the cool part is if you click on the custom line, it has a bunch of presets for us that we can begin to work with. So that's where I would generally suggest we start, or you start with all of your draft renders. And then if you need a specialty aesthetic, then you can start to seek settings that other people have sort of set up that would help you get there. So I'll show you some great resources for how to dig that stuff up later on in the semester too. But anyway, what we're going to start with here is bright interior. We might have to switch to an exterior lighting, but we'll try it. Don't worry about film back, just leave that as the default. The output resolution here, I mentioned resolution. Resolution is the number of pixels that it's going to output as a raster graphic. Okay, so that's the size of the image. I guess, you know what, I won't go further into that until we're ready to talk about it at great length. Okay, because you just need to know like what actual size these things are. Anyway, so aperture, right? Like all this stuff about focus, lens, and diaphragm, and all that stuff. It's all just about getting these fine-tuned focusing techniques, right? Like how you can get a foreground and background focus and stuff like that. So right now the defaults are going to be fine for us. I do want you to jump over to location and time. It should still be set up from last time, but generally speaking, in this program meaning this architecture program, most of our projects that we're designing are here in Southern California. So it would behoove you to know how to switch this to our location. It's as easy as just clicking that list and finding Los Angeles. Should be on here. It's not on here?
No, it is. You type in L, USA L.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is, right there. Under Long Beach. Logan, Livermore, 1.
There we go. I don't know what AP, oh, airport, and I don't know what the other one is. All right. So anyway, so that gives you the latitude, longitude, and then you're actually setting the physical position of the sun when you change this. So remember, we recalled last class that showing the sun in the viewport here is going to show you the actual position of the sun. But we already tested that, so we kind of know where it is while we're rendering. The environment. Okay, so I mentioned that for the most part, we're going to use physical sky in almost all applications. Particularly this one, because we're trying to study the actual effect of light in interior space as it leaks in from the exterior environment. So make sure that use sun is checked and physical sky is on. And then we kind of need to talk about a few of, I guess, these properties, I suppose. So that's fine. So basically, color temperature is going to be how you can get different wavelengths of light throughout your space. So you can get warm light or cool light, which is going to basically be anywhere from bluish light to white light to reddish light, and it'll go everywhere in between, like yellows and stuff like that. So the good thing about color temperature is we can change that after. So I'll show you in the output settings how to do that. It's actually going to be really great for you guys to be able to learn a little bit more about color temperature without having to do 1,000 draft renders. The power and radius is really just about how far the spread of light is coming from the light source. In this case, it's kind of coming from everywhere. But we can increase and decrease the power. I think if you're going to mess with any three of these to get started, just mess with power. But again, those three settings, maybe not radius, but temperature and power, you can modify on the back end with ease. Intensity as well is sort of the same thing. It's how much light is coming out of the light source. And I just want to take a moment to specifically call out turbidity. Again, I mentioned that a bunch of times now that that Maxwell is a physical rendering engine. It's a physical-based engine. So it actually calculates how much interference there is in the air of the environment. So turbidity is kind of the way that you're going to get more of a diffuse haze across the sky versus a pure light. Wavelength, that just changes, the, how do I want to describe that? I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I forget exactly how to describe that. But my suspicion, I kind of recall that that is more about what kind of hue of light you're getting. But anyway, so we're going to work on turbidity, intensity, a little bit of wavelength, but everything else from that you probably don't want to mess with too much. We don't have any water in the scene, or I mean, you could mess with ozone. It's going to create a different upper level sky rendering than you would typically get. But let's leave it at the defaults for our first render, and then let's go check out those output settings. So here there are a couple things that you need to know on just a file management and setup level. Generally, I kind of just blast through outputting my renders, and I'll bet you my documents folder is just filled to the brim with draft renders that I started and canceled 100 times. Up top, you can set it so that you predefine the name of the rendering and where it goes in a folder location. Okay, so I typically don't do that. But you would just navigate to a folder location here, and that's where your renderings are going to go. Okay, you can auto name and save the particular renderings and file types. Image, the MXS file, and the MXI file. Those are your Maxwell render files, so you can go back into them and basically change some of those levels that I mentioned before. Like, you can keep working on it in the Maxwell Studio environment. So if you want to use those, just check those boxes and you can save those files too. But generally speaking, if I want to keep, I do a bunch of renderings to kind of show you guys things and you know, test different settings. So generally I don't do that. I just save the ones that I want to keep. But it's up to you. You can use that if you wish. So I want to talk to you real quick, I guess, about this next section, engine. They're incredibly important, all of these. Time limit and sampling level. The time, like I said, I think last week, I believe I said to you all that Maxwell will, generally speaking, render forever, right? And it'll keep getting better and better and better over an infinite amount of time. It's just, you're not going to, it'll take you years to finish some of your sampling levels later on. So you can set this to 9,999 minutes, or basically forever, or a limit of sampling levels. So what I've found to be a good balance for a draft render is anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes, with maybe a sampling level of like 10 or 15. It won't get to 10 or 15. The minutes limit will, almost in all cases, cap that off. So I'm going to set this to 10, and I'm just going to cut this off at 15. I don't generally modify threads in priority. I just don't think that in this class we're going to need to. But what I do want to point out here is quality and multi-light. Okay, quality and multi-light they have a relationship, and you need to know it. Production quality is basic, and let me just say, like, they try to keep this really simple, which is nice. They have draft and they have production. Draft just is really low resolution comparatively. So the use of multi-light defines our ability to change the color of lighting in the post-production phase, or we can change the intensity of lighting. So when we set multi-light, like let's say we want to change our lighting levels later on, we have to have it on production. If you put it on draft, you won't have any post-production capabilities with your actual physical lights in the space. That's a very significant one. So if you didn't take notes on anything else here so far in this video, that's the one. Okay? MXI output composite is fine. I don't think we really have any use for the others. So for the most part, I guess our other settings are going to be fine. We can modify temperature and we can modify tint. I believe we can even do gamma afterwards. So I guess let's get a draft rendering out. Make sure that your layers that you're trying to render are actually on. So I'll turn that one off, turn these on, and let's see here. I guess we can go for, yeah, I don't have any physical lights in the space yet, so that's good. Cool, let's do a draft render. So right. You'll see that I typically will overwrite just all the time, so that's the same thing that you've been seeing all the while. That doesn't seem right. Hang on. All right, so I just let this run for a couple minutes, but I guess I wanted to call out the only real significant thing that's going to change here that won't really do that much yet, but it is, I think, very useful to you. So it's this thing right here. It's the multi-light panel, this guy. Okay, this is super important because that's how you're going to be able to post-produce some of your lighting levels in all of your environments. And what you'll see in the next segment is that all of the lighting types that you put in your space are all going to show up in this panel as well, so you can change, you know, like how bright the lights are inside your space as well as the environment around it. So forgive me for not being a photographer myself, but ISO and shutter are how you're going to allow more or less light into the space. Okay, and the relationship for how the two work and balance, I'm not the one to ask, but generally speaking, if your shutter speed goes up, the darkness of the image should go down, and if your shutter speed goes down, then the brightness of the image goes up. And theoretically, that's because it leaves the shutter of the camera open longer, and it lets the light in. So more light in. Does that make sense? So ISO I couldn't really tell you. But anyway, so right now I don't know why my preview is like totally burnt out, but that's where you're going to see a major change in how the setting is really going to update. And every time you do this, the next sampling level is when it's going to update in the actual image. So I'll turn ISO up and see if that's going to update it here in 10 seconds or so. Yes?
Typically, ISO, like, I don't know what it is for digital, but for film, it's the sensitivity to light. So, for example, if you get something that's 100 ISO, that's you get higher quality images for at least film, and you can shoot outdoors because it needs more sun to affect it. But if you want to shoot like outdoors with a film camera at nighttime, you need like an ISO of like 1600, and you need to have your shutter open for a
Makes sense.
time.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. All right, so anyway, the next segment, that didn't really seem to change much, but when we get into the interior environment where you can change individual lights and light types, you're going to see a lot more, hopefully, flexibility here in this space with the lighting. So let's, I mean, feel free to go through with your renders here as I get set up for the next one, and then I think I'm just going to let this one keep running, and then we'll revisit it after it's had the chance to run for a while. By the way, you guys probably by now, after last week, have realized that you can just let a bunch of these run, you know, and you just set them in the background and they keep running. One thing I think Maxwell is really good at is not eating up too much of your CPU, right? Our suite here is running off of the CPU, not the graphics processor. So actually, these computers don't have a graphics card. It's just your onboard, meaning it's embedded into your motherboard graphics cards. So we do CPU rendering generally here in class. But you can just let a bunch of them run because the CPUs on these things, they're workstation, like workhorse CPUs, so they can handle a lot.